Redditors who knew men caught on To Catch a Predator before the show. What were they like? This will get buried at this point, but my friend dated someone who ended up disappearing. Then we eventually found out he had been arrested for trying to sleep with an underage girl and having rope and guns in his trunk. It wasn't until a few weeks later that we even learned he was on the show. It just kept unraveling. He had come to get drinks for one of my birthdays, and to be honest, he seemed completely normal. There was nothing that stood out to me as creepy or off. My friend was a wreck after everything happened. She's a smart girl too and didn't expect anything like that as far as I know. I felt really bad for her. Didn't actually know the guy, but one guy showed up to the sting in a company semi-truck. It is blurred out in the episode, but the company is Covenant Transport. I went to work for them a few years after the episode. During orientation they gave us a list of things that will result in immediate termination. Things like driving under the influence, failing a drug screen, and impromptu meetings with Chris Hansen. That's good they had a sense of humor about it. I went to school with Rob Klein. From what I can remember of him was that he was quiet and kept to himself. He never did anything to label himself a creep. His excuse for showing up has to be one of the worst. Rob said he showed up to let the 13-year-old girl know he wasn't going to be able to hang out after making the 2-hour drive there. He also throws his brother under the bus for the child pee that is on his computer. I'm surprised none of them ever pulled the big brain move of yelling. It finally worked. I've been trying so hard to get on your show. Huge fan. I'm pretty late to the game, but my husband worked with good friends with one of the men on the first ever episode. We were all in our late 20s. He was a highly educated, well-liked guy. He was nice, funny as heck. We were all shocked. He got busted trying to sleep with a 12 or 14-year-old girl. He got a good lawyer, and so the TCAP didn't show the video of him getting busted, only a photo that he shared in the chat with who he thought was the young girl. We read the chat log between him and the girl. It was disgusting. He called my husband one time after the show aired to say that this was the first time he did anything like this, and he got caught up in the taboo nature of it. Never spoke to him again. I met the ex-wife of a police officer that was on To Catch a Predator a few years ago. We were both prospective jurors for a sex crime. She was dismissed because of her relationship to the law enforcement profession and because her ex-husband was involved in a sex crime. She had to discuss the whole story to the entire court during voir dire. Voir dire in my experience was pretty awkward. Everybody in a big group has to talk about their weird life's baggage in front of everyone else and answer personal questions. One journalist that was a prospective juror had something to tell the court privately and they had to dismiss us all from the room. Came back and the journalist was gone. Not on To Catch a Predator, but I had a youth hockey coach who I always thought was a really nice guy. I was like 14 at the time, but he'd always call me after games and give me tips and pointers, and I never found it weird. Just figured he was a good guy doing something for kids. He didn't have any children though. 20 years later or so I see him at a rink. To my surprise, he remembers me. We talk for a half an hour. He asks me about my parents. I show him pictures of my family. He starts telling me about this girl that he coached since she was 10 on a girls hockey team who is now in college playing for a very good school. I'll be honest, I didn't think anything of it. Anyway, we go our separate ways but do exchange phone numbers. I go home and tell my wife that I saw my old hockey coach and I'd like to invite him over for a cookout. I figured I'd call him over the weekend. Literally the very next day, he gets arrested for trying to meet up with a 13-year-old girl in a chat room that was really the state police. I never invited him. I didn't know the guy before the show, but after. This was over a decade ago, back in 2008 or 2009. I was on a dating website and was talking to a guy that claimed to be a doctor. I thought it was very unusual that this doctor, Morris Wolin, had so much free time throughout the day to text me so frequently. Texting back then was a bit time consuming with flip phones. Was also begging me to meet up with him and telling me he wanted to shower me with all these gifts. He seemed a bit arrogant and pompous to me, in the way he would brag about his wealth and cars. I was getting suspicious of the guy and reverse searched his phone number. I found out he gave me a fake name. and after getting his real name, I saw all the articles online and saw the guy was on TCAP. I couldn't believe what I was seeing and asked him to send me a new selfie. Sure enough, it was definitely him. I ghosted him and blocked his number and reported his profile to Plenty of Fish and told them he was on TCAP. Just really glad I never met up with him. Be careful out there everyone. Rappy, extremely rappy, was someone from my hometown in NY. Went to school with their younger sister. After he graduated high school, he did everything he could to hang out with much younger kids. Always wanted to buy booze for us or roll up a joint and smoke us out in his van. Never touched me, but there were rumors of him molesting a 12-year-old in sleepaway camp. I knew a dude like this. He lived on the same block as a friend. He was 21 and drove an old van. Hung out with a bunch of 14-16-year-olds. Drove everyone around so they could drink and smoke. He ended up fooling around with a 14-year-old. He was told by someone's dad that if he was seen hanging around with them again the cops would be called. A supervisor at my previous job got busted in a big sting at the end of last year with a bunch of other dudes. He was kinda dumpy in appearance but thought he was hot crap, both at the job and with the women. He wasn't. There were more than a few who transferred out of his area or specifically asked not to work directly with him. A couple of them said he just creeped them out and let his touch linger longer than was polite. He was just another shitbag to me. One of those guys that never did anything unless the boss was around. Liked to be the one at the company meetings who told everyone to quiet down and listen up when it was already quiet. I hate that crap. And it's almost always after they were the ones who were being rowdy. I've seen it too many times. I was one dude's ra in university. He was a seriously weird dude, but was relatively friendly, came out to all of the campus events, and was not suspected of being a predator at all by any of us in the dorms back in those days. He was busted on TCAP about 2-3 years after I graduated, so probably sometime 2003 to 2005. I fortunately don't know any predators, but I did work with a young woman who had worked on the show. She did the post-production voiceovers for the catfishing texts between the detectives and the predators. She was the voice of the non-existent teen girl, like the "oh I don't know much about sex, I'm only 13 LOL" stuff. Apparently she was a production assistant or intern at a production office, and one of the producers was like, "We need somebody with a young sounding voice, you say something," and she did, and he was like, "Perfect. Come with me," and she recorded all the dialogue. Right after she told a bunch of us at work. This was a couple years later at a different job. I went home that night and watched an episode and could tell it absolutely was her voice. Hilarious. I've always wondered about the girls who do the voices, haha. That's so interesting that they picked a member of the crew. Yes, Matty Nash. He was creepy and kept trying to get me to go to Burning Man. When I told him I didn't think that was a good idea because I had a 10-year-old kid at the time, he said I should bring my kid. Now I don't think he was interested in my kid at all, but I did tell him I thought that would be super creepy to bring a kid to Burning Man with a bunch of people on E. This was in 2001. He came over to my house under the guise of talking business and then put the moves on me. I turned him down and sent him home to his wife. Several years ago, a woman I know went full cougar mode when this 20-something lifeguard started flirting with her. Turns out, he was more interested in her preteen son. That was his MO. He would target single moms and date them to get access to the kid. I don't know anyone from the show, but I was very close to my father, who is a predator. Middle-aged geeky dude. Had 2 daughters. I was 18. My sibling 20 at the time of arrest. Bit socially awkward but known as a really kind guy. Always generous with his time. Worked at a community center helping underprivileged kids learn how to use computers. Yeah, turns out he was molesting at least 2 girls from there, 4 and 8, and hosting a child P ring from the center's server. No one suspected it. He loved kids, but that's cause he had to, right? He'd fix everyone's computers for free and help them get into work. Really great upstanding citizen. He got 16 years and everyone else got a lifetime of trust issues and trauma. I didn't know the person directly, but I worked at a company that had an employee caught on the show. This was particularly problematic, as the company was Nickelodeon Animation. Everyone who knew the guy was actually pretty shocked. It was particularly rough for his girlfriend at the time, as she also worked at the studio, so there was no hiding from it. For their part, Nickelodeon instituted rigorous background checks for every new employee after the incident, with zero tolerance for any misdeeds involving children. Those background checks are what keeps this lore alive though, as a process if much more intensive than any other studio. I remember that episode and recall they specifically pointed out on the show that he worked for Nickelodeon. I just knew a kid whose dad was on the show when we were in middle school. Always felt really bad for the kid and his family. Dang, that had to suck for your classmate. Oh, I can actually answer this one. He legit was always trying to sleep with men that were way too young for him, albeit just barely legal, and we made jokes all the time to him about how he was going to wind up on that show. We literally called him Herbert. It was the opposite of a he was the last person I would suspect situation. I never expected Dwight to go postal. It's always the last person you expect, and I always expected Dwight to go postal. Never heard of this show, so I googled it. Why did To Catch a Predator get cancelled? Cancellation. The show was cancelled in 2008, in part because Louis Conrad, an assistant district attorney in Rockwall County, Texas, shot himself after he was caught talking to and exchanging pictures with a perverted justice volunteer posing as a 13-year-old boy. Haha, wow, WTF. Yeah, wild, hey, haha. It was actually really bad though, because everyone they caught that season got let off because of that. I don't think he was on the show, but when I was waiting to leave for Navy boot camp, one of the recruiters was caught in a sting operation. He thought he was texting and meeting up with a teenage girl and went to meet her during work, while in uniform, and in his government vehicle. I know he was arrested, but I don't know what happened besides that his wife divorced him if I recall correctly. Actually, a friend of mine's roommate ended up being one. He was super normal and kind of good looking. He had a girlfriend as well. The only odd thing about him was that he had inherited a bunch of money from his family all in cash. Aside from that, he was in his 20s and you'd never think it at all. He was one of the ones that thought he was meeting a 16-year-old girl or something like that. He also wasn't very bright. I thought they always said 14 years and younger to be able to go after them legally. I've seen a lot of clips online and never saw older than 14 years. Wasn't on the show, but one of my good friends was arrested earlier this year after a 2-month-long investigation for a count each of possession, accessing and distributing CP with COVID. I haven't seen him since early 2020, but we talked almost at least once or twice a week, sharing memes, jokes and whatnot. Really good guy, always down to help you out when needed. He was a very normal guy and none of our friends saw it coming. He'd never had a girlfriend or anything like that, but we didn't really think anything of it, just assumed he was having the same luck we were with dating. Most people we know think he didn't do it, but a 2-month-long investigation is pretty damning. Losing a friend in this manner sucks, but he did what he did and you can't do that. It was my best friend's dad. I slept over there all the time as a kid and hung out. He was relatively normal, to be honest. Worked a lot. My friend and I recall getting on their home computer when we were younger and there were pictures of trips to Thailand and it looked like he was at some strip club. The strippers looked like children, but we didn't think anything of it because we were kids and figured the women looked younger in Thailand. They ended up moving out to California and he got caught on the show during my junior year of college. He called my family and all of the other families to explain that he never did anything to us. As far as I know, he didn't. I didn't know him personally, but he went to the same church as me when my parents forced me to be religious, and I never knew he existed. He tried to lure an 11-year-old girl from the internet to the local park, pretending to be her age, but that 11-year-old girl was actually a 19-year-old dude, I think that was his age, who had known about him being a creep and wanted to turn him into police for it. Guess the guy is lucky the dude didn't lure him in to beat the crap out of him. I know someone who used to do that. Him and his friends would lure pedophiles out, rob them and beat the crap out of them. Ah, stunning. Remember the fine young lad who got caught not once, but twice? Went to my high school. Had a class or two with him. Another not on the show story. A 50-ish professor at the university that I work at got caught in a sting trying to meet an underage boy for sex in a parking lot. I was watching the news in bed with my wife, and when his mugshot appeared I startled the crap out of her by shouting yes and jumping out of the bed. The guy was just a complete butthole. I was 25 or so at the time, working as the web guy in the marketing department. I had just recently had a meeting with him and his department to demo their newly redesigned department website. They, the art design department, didn't like the new website because it actually followed university standards, used approved colors and fonts, had the required university header, etc. They wanted to keep their dumpster fire of a website that broke every rule and looked incredibly unprofessional. When I refused to back down and explained that part of my job was ensuring that all department websites met the standards which had been mandated by the president and board of directors, this butthole erupted at me. He started yelling at the top of his lungs about how I'm not a designer and had no business telling them what to do. I was just a couple of years out of college, getting berated and insulted by a 10-year department chair. I was incredibly intimidated and couldn't stop my dang body from shaking. But since it was literally my job to enforce the rules, I stood my ground. He stormed out of the room. Despite my best efforts to keep my composure, I found myself wiping angry tears from my eyes. A couple of his colleagues tried to apologize for him, but I knew that if I stayed in that room any longer I was going to lose it, so I quickly got out of there without making eye contact with anyone. Just a couple of weeks later, his mugshot was on the news and I was jumping for joy in front of my very puzzled wife. You should have replaced his photo on the website with his mugshot. There was a kid who went to my middle school who went to meet up with this 14-year-old girl who he told he was 21 for some reason. He was actually 13. He took his mom's minivan and drove about 20 miles to go see her. I don't think they ever aired that episode, but I remember hearing Chris Hansen and the rest of the perverted justice team were pee. Officers called his mom and that was pretty much the end of it. He was at school the following Monday and it was almost like it never even happened, lol. It was the talk around my small town down there in GA though. I'm still friends with him on Facebook. He's married with a few kids now. I remember an episode with a predator who's a doctor in San Francisco. He's tall and scrawny and I'll never forget the way he reacted when caught. He threw his glasses on the floor in absolute defeat. I could tell he saw his life flash before his eyes. I wonder if anybody knew that guy and what became of him. What an absolute moron. Threw away a grand life to take advantage of little girls when he could have had paid anyone he wanted, who's not a minor. He died like a month or two ago. After TCAP he separated from his wife temporarily, but they got back together for the kids. Did 2 months in jail after fighting the charges, without success. Had his medical license permanently revoked and worked as a medical consultant afterwards. Name was Morris Wolin, aka Tall Dreamy Doc Marco. What a ride. His chat is an absolute hoot. I didn't know anyone from that show, but I did know a guy who got caught for the same thing. It was the early 2000s. He was my friend's husband. He met a 13-14-year-old girl in a D&D chat room when he was in his mid-20s. Groomed her, traveled to another state to see her, then took her to New Orleans. He got caught, a lot of years in jail. My friend divorced him. He was extremely egotistical, and I always hated him. To the right people he came across as charming. He used everyone and everything he could, named himself after a popular vampire, but spelled it wrong. I remember throwing his stupid red lens glasses into the street. He was the type to buy booze for teenagers. Anyone remember Walter Babst? He was the high school teacher that got busted on the show then went back to work for a few days. I went to that high school, but I was never in one of his classes, so I can't exactly comment on how he was before. I had him for geometry and remember him coming to class afterwards and just keeping his head down in his arms for an hour awkwardly. Weren't on to catch a predator, but my ex-stepdad was a pedophile. Before he went to jail for his 3rd time, my mom didn't know when she married him. We would see his family a lot. His brother was always very nice and liked having us over. They would sometimes get weird with each other and his brother would make comments about my body every now and then. After my ex-stepdad went to jail, his brother was caught on an online chat sting. He somehow got my contact info when I was an adult and thought it was appropriate to tell me he was attracted to me when I was 12. Weirdly, they both didn't like each other being alone with young girls and at least once referred to the other one as a pedophile. I was too young to really understand it back then. Talk about competition between them, I guess. Mine is bad. He wasn't on the show but recently found out a friend bandmate was the worst of the worst. Last December his GF came home to the SWAT team at her house escorting him out with all the electronics in the house. Turns out they had been watching him for years, gathering evidence on other people he was trading photos videos with. I think he led them down a path to catch a lot of people at the same time. He had a daughter, 2 years, that was his victim as well. He was finally arrested when he agreed to meet a young boy. He was the absolute last person you'd expect. Nice, funny, great guitar player, and a good friend. We played live shows, had music videos and a decent album we released. We had to take all videos of him off YouTube and all music of him off Spotify and crap. I hope he dies in jail. Not on the show because we're not American, but there was a group that was looking for people accessing certain sites and my cousin's ex was one of them. She actually found out by checking his computer, but it was horrifying to her. I was a kid around this time, so what I remember from him is that for the most part he was quiet. One thing is in our culture we kiss each other's cheeks as a greeting, but when I did it I think I missed or something, don't remember exact details, and the whole family laughed lightheartedly. I looked back at him but there was this weird look in his eyes I couldn't exactly understand as a kid, which freaked me out immensely. I remember kind of running away in a weird embarrassment afterwards, but it's a memory that stuck to me for my whole life. A few years ago my cousin confessed about why they really broke up all of those years ago, and I just remember that specific moment and felt so scared like I did as a kid. It's a face I don't think I'll forget. Holy crap. I worked with a guy who was eventually convicted of raping his girlfriend's kid over a period of like 8 years. I would have known him while this was just getting started. Apparently the guy ran in some pedo circles online and was recognized when another guy got busted with some of the videos my colleague had filmed. Freaking disgusting. I was appalled when I found out, but it honestly pieces together pretty well. Dude is a chubby, quiet, awkward nerd with a Disney obsession and enough tech savviness to think he could get away with something like this. Good at his job though. I liked him and was a reference for him a couple of times. Bothers me quite a bit to think about how close I was to this creep. One of my bosses at an old job thought he was in an online relationship with a 12-year-old girl, but it was the cops. When he was arrested his wife actually came to the store to ask them not to fire him. I never liked him and I wasn't surprised. Well, he, 40s at the time, wasn't on the show but he was busted in a police sting. Thought he was meeting a 14-year-old girl at a park and he had a bag of lingerie for her. He had been chatting online with an officer posing as the 14-year-old. Creepy stuff. Anyway, he was part of my friend group at the time. I wasn't super close with him but I had spent some time around him and pretty normal group activities. He was a bit weird but most of our group was, so he didn't really stand out. He would make some pretty odd comments about women, and especially younger women, at times and usually get mocked for it, but I don't think any of us thought he'd do anything like he did. He was married, happily to the best of my knowledge, and had a really good government job. When news reached our friend group it was a pretty big shock to all of us, but it definitely brought to mind some of the weird crap he used to say. Pretty sure everyone pretty much immediately blocked him on social media. I don't know how much time he spent in jail if any. I know he lost his wife and his job. Last I heard he had moved across the country. He doesn't come up in conversation much anymore, but anytime he does we refer to him as Pedophile Bob. I feel like I can contribute to this because for the guy I knew it was everything the same but not on TV. That is, he arranged to meet an underage girl for sex but it was a police sting and he was arrested. But it was a police operation and subsequently in the news. He was my boss and so I had a few meetings with him and stuff. He seemed alright, a bit quiet, normal. Not very sociable but pleasant and reasonably popular because for instance at Christmas he would allocate some funds to his junior managers to take employees for a meal at Christmas. And he didn't seem to be concerned about being popular or anything. Just a nice gesture. I never heard that he was anything other than professional at work. Not inappropriate to the adult women I worked with, as far as I know. He did apparently have a marriage breakdown and shack up with a much younger girl woman, which was gossiped about, but more in terms of how did that guy manage to shack up with a trophy girlfriend gossip because he was 50 something and not attractive. probably on fairly good money, though. It was interesting to see someone you knew going through the press about it. The article in the paper genuinely made me think, look at him, he does look like a pedo. Small, balding, skinny, big glasses, mugshot. But how ridiculous is that? I knew the guy. I never thought he looks like a pedo before there was a mugshot in the paper next to the word pedophile. Also, the paper made a big deal out of the fact that when they raided his office at my work they found a sex kit, condoms and wet wipes and a towel, I think, and made out like that was somehow damning in itself. Sure, it's sort of inappropriate stuff to bring to work, but they don't imply pedophilia. Basically the article was about how much of a sinister creep he was, but honestly, other than actually being a sinister creep in that he arranged to meet a teenage girl for sex on the internet, the other attributes of his personality were entirely normal. Funny thing was he was arrested in a sting and bailed, and while he was waiting for the Poyle's Crown Prosecution Service to do whatever they do, preparing a trial or whatever, he did it again. He was stung, doing exactly the same thing, by the police. Again, I mean, really, you'd really think you might have learned your lesson. If you are new to the channel, you can subscribe. I publish new videos every day. Until then, check another video. Bye for now.